One of Atari's biggest hits of the 1970s comes home in this video with Breakout. It's undeniable that Atari initially made its name with Pong. This simple two-player take on a tennis game was an incredible arcade success for the company, with competing clone machines popping up in the years following its 1972 debut. Even the earliest years of the home console market saw an array of Pong clones, itself a clone of the tennis game on the original Magnavox Odyssey. There's just one problem with Pong. It's a two-player game. If you don't have someone to play with, you're not going to spend money on it. There are two ways to tackle this problem, and Atari essentially covered them both. The first is the solution seen in the 1977 VCS game Video Olympics, where developer Joe DeCure programmed a simple computer opponent for players to compete against. This required actually having the memory available and the processing power to actually create your digital foe, and in the mid-1970s, these were both in short supply. The other option was to reimagine Pong as a single-player game. This had been done in a couple ways by other developers. Ramtech's Howell Ivy developed Clean Sweep in 1974, a simple take on the concept where the player bounces a ball off a paddle to try and collect all the dots on screen. Midway released its own single-player paddle game called TV Flipper early in 1975. This seemingly was a licensed release of a game developed by Ramtech called Knockout. XD released a nearly identical game at about the same time called TV Pinball, though the relationship is uncertain. Clean Sweep, TV Pinball, and TV Flipper are more mashups of Pong and pinball machines, as the goal is to hit targets with a paddle and ball, but they are some early examples of developers trying to make a single-player Pong game work. Back at Atari, Nolan Bushnell and Steve Bristow came up with their own idea for a solution, seemingly based on the racquetball craze of the 1970s. What if, instead of volleying a ball back and forth with another player, you were bouncing a ball off a wall, destroying it, and then trying to catch the ball to do it over again? The history is a bit spotty here, but according to internal memos, this initial proposal for Clean Sweep with a closed field that you knock out was proposed around January 1975. This all happened right on the cusp of microprocessors becoming the preferred way to design arcade machines, and Atari, interested in reducing the number of logic chips they needed to get for their games, and thus the cost, offered a bonus for keeping the number of chips used below 120. None of Atari's engineers were interested in taking up the task, however, as they considered ball and paddle games to be old news. Atari game technician Steve Jobs, yes, the same guy who went on to co-found Apple Computers, volunteered to design this single-player Pong game, interested in the bonus. Bushnell and Bristow, expecting little but realizing Jobs knew some talented friends, gave him the assignment. Jobs then turned around and convinced his friend and future Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak to help him, promising half of the $700 base pay for the work. Jobs, it was later learned, never mentioned the rest of the rather sizable potential bonus to Wozniak. Over the course of an intense, draining weekend, Wozniak successfully designed a breakout board that used about 42 logic chips, which Jobs wire-wrapped into a prototype. This version of the game was missing key features, such as full scoring, sound, and coin control, but it worked as a starting point. This all likely occurred within the first few months of 1975, because Wozniak mentions working on a breakthrough game in an April 1975 Homebrew Computer Club newsletter. This could be a reference to this prototype, though I can't say for certain. To quote Nelson Muntz, records from that era are spotty at best. Some of Wozniak's shortcuts resulted in a design too complicated for Atari's own production PCBs. Nevertheless, because the bonus offer didn't specify it had to be producible, Jobs got a $5,000 bonus. This is where the timeline gets murky again. From February on, Atari memos mention a game called Brick being in development and expected to have a working prototype by April, initially listed right under the Clean Sweep game idea. Later on, another game, entitled Breakthrough, is location tested in July before being shelved. This may or may not be the same game as Brick and what we know as Breakout today. It's speculative, but we do know that a group of disgruntled Atari designers swiped several game ideas and designs and started their own company, Fun Games, around this time. They released a game in late 1975 as part of their Take-7 Pong clone machine called Bust Out that was essentially just Sideways Breakout. Development on a brick-breaking paddle game at Atari seemingly took a hit, but it wasn't dead yet. Towards the end of 1975, Gary Waters of Cyan Engineering was tapped to go back to the Breakout project, redo Wozniak's version of the hardware, and finish the game. He did so using about 100 logic chips, adding the scoring, audio, and a 2-player option in the process. This game, dubbed Breakout, debuted in May 1976 and quickly became Atari's most popular arcade machine up until 1979's Asteroids. In its first year, Atari sold between 11 and 15,000 units domestically. The game was also a global hit. Atari rewarded their West German distributor, Lowen Automaten, a platinum unit in 1977 for outstanding sales. The game was even a bigger hit in Japan, where Namco was Atari's official distributor. Namco ended up working with the Yakuza mob to manufacture illegal copies without giving Atari their cut. Other companies, from the future SNK to Nintendo to Namco itself, were creating and selling their own takes on Breakout. So naturally, Atari wanted to sell a home version of their big arcade hit. Their first home version was included on their 1977 dedicated home console Video Pinball, alongside their own take on a pinball Pong mashup and a proper video pinball game. This was around the same time that the VCS started making its way onto store shelves as well, and having gotten itself established on the market, Atari wanted to bring Breakout to its programmable machine as well. The task of bringing Breakout to the VCS was one 2 programmers were interested in and available to do, Brad Stewart and Ian Shepard. To decide who got the job, they had an actual Breakout competition using the arcade machine. Stewart ended up clearing the screen and got the ball into a loop, while Shepard ended up missing the ball entirely. Stewart got the job and went to work. Stewart said he initially had problems developing with the system's TIA display chip, which he found had a steep learning curve. Joe DeCure, who developed the VCS version of Pong, Video Olympics, offered Stewart some advice on how he would try implementing the game. This caused things to click for Stewart, who said in an interview that the rest of the development was relatively straightforward. Breakout's default mode on the VCS is a straightforward port of the arcade game. You clear the bricks out from the wall by bouncing around a ball with your paddle, though there are 2 key differences from the arcade version that make this an easier task. There are only 6 rows of bricks for the home version as opposed to the arcade's 8 rows, and the number of lives has been increased from 3 to 5 for the VCS version. Like the arcade, the ball speeds up once it hits some of the higher bricks, and your paddle will be reduced in size once the ball reaches the top of the screen. Also like the arcade version, a second wall appears once you finish the first one. Clearing that second wall will end the game, leaving the player with a maximum possible score of 864 points. Stewart's alternate game options are where Breakout gets interesting. There are 3 major variants of Breakout on the cartridge: normal, arcade-style Breakout, which we've covered already; timed Breakout, where players must try to remove the 2 walls as quickly as possible as the clock counts the seconds used; and breakthrough, where the ball will simply smash on through every brick on its trajectory before hitting a wall or the top of the screen and returning back down. Additionally, each of these major variants has 4 ways to play: an invisible wall mode, where you can only see the bricks when you hit one; catch, where you can hold the button on the paddle controller to hold the ball as it hits, though it retains its momentum and angle once you let go; steerable, which allows you to influence the ball's directional velocity by spinning the paddle; and finally, there's plain old Breakout. Taking full advantage of the paddle controllers, Stewart included options to play every single one of these game types with 2, 3, or 4 players. While a 2-player game will simply alternate whose turn it is, like on the arcade machine, playing with 3 or 4 players will divide everyone into 2 teams of 1 or 2 players, with teammates splitting up which side of the screen they can move around in. As an added option to tweak the game, moving the difficulty switches to A will reduce the size of the paddles. This makes for a pretty complete package of options for what was originally a pretty simple game. Standard Breakout is a fun enough game, though timed Breakout seems really more for expert players. Breakthrough is where I feel the cartridge really shines, as it results in a fast-paced game where the ball is speeding along practically from the first volley. The 3 lesser variants are fairly basic, but both the steerable ball and the catch game types are a huge boon to avoiding that maddening situation where 1 block is left and you just can't hit it. The invisible wall is a bit of a stinker unless you're really good at directing your shots, but it is also disappointing that there's no way to double or triple up on these lesser options. Even so, Breakout is easily the best game we've seen so far in 1978, and is one of the most fondly remembered games of that era of VCS development for a good reason. Reviews at the time were high on the cart, especially the breakthrough game type. In the summer 1979 issue of Video Magazine, Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz said that the home cartridge was a must-own for its speed and angle changes, noting that Breakthrough in particular was addictive and great for tournaments due to how quick rounds would go. And an August 1981 Video Magazine review of the Atari 400 notes that Breakout was one of the best-selling VCS carts of its day, only recently eclipsed in popularity by Space Invaders. It ended up being a steady seller under the Atari Corporation VCS run as well, selling roughly 28,000 copies between 1986 and 1988, not at all shabby for an early port of an even older arcade game. Breakout was big enough of a success in arcades that nearly all of Atari's early competitors had their own take on the game, though some turned out decidedly better than others. The first one out the door was Fairchild's Pinball Challenge cartridge, which despite the name is just Breakout. The basic premise is that you have 7 balls to try and destroy as many bricks and walls as you can. To make up for the fact that the system doesn't have paddle controls, the paddle can be sped up or slowed down by pushing the controller forward or backward while moving. It is also, frankly, huge and thus harder to whiff with. Like Atari's, there's a variety of game types in here, allowing you to adjust the size of the paddle, the speed of the ball, alternate control of the paddle between 2 players, play cooperatively with each player tackling moving left or right, or most interestingly, play an offense-defense version where the second player controls a blocker paddle trying to protect the wall. The invisible wall also makes an appearance here. It's not as good as Atari's version, but it's not at all bad. Bally had a version on their professional arcade cartridge, Brickyard Clowns. This version is a bit odd. The ball actually has momentum that can adjust the speed and direction it's moving in. The professional arcade does feature a spinner, making controlling the paddle practically a breeze. The game has options to adjust ball speed and paddle size, but otherwise is pretty straightforward. APF released a clone in 1978 for their MP1000 called Brickdown, which turns Breakout on its side. Other than adjusting the number of wall layers and ball speed, there's nothing really of note here. Jumping ahead a couple years, Magnavox brought out its own clone, Blockout Breakdown, for the Odyssey 2. What sets this version apart from others is that the player is competing against either another player or the computer, who is trying to repair the wall as it gets destroyed using little demons that grab bricks from the side of the screen before placing them in an empty space. Blackout is a standard Breakout game otherwise, while Breakdown follows the Atari Breakthrough rule set, allowing the first player to plow through the bricks. Mattel even developed its own Breakout clone, Breakout, for the Intellivision, though it went unreleased until the 1998 Intellivision Lives computer compilation. Originally intended to be part of the Triple Action cartridge, the game was axed out of concerns that Atari might file a lawsuit against them. The game, which involves balls slowly coming down towards the players, is reportedly popular amongst the programmers internally. And in 1982, the console known in the US as the Arcadia 2001 featured Breakaway, a clone with a variety of options from the original VCS port, including invisible bricks, differing paddle sizes, catching the ball, and breakthrough. The console doesn't feature paddles, but allows you to shift your speed by pushing one of the keypad buttons. Notably, even Wozniak himself developed a Breakout clone for the Apple II using its basic language interpreter, and spent time making sure that the computer would be capable enough to run his game during the design phase. Atari would revisit the concept a few more times. An arcade sequel, Super Breakout, was released in 1978 with a console port for both the VCS and the 5200. While the VCS version of Super Breakout looks nicer than its predecessor, it has a completely different set of game types and only works with 2 players. Much later in the VCS's lifespan, Atari Corporation published another take on the game, Off the Wall, which featured power-ups but didn't use the paddle controllers to its detriment. This was likely a response to Taito's August 1986 release Arkanoid, which was essentially Breakdown with different brick patterns, power-ups, and the occasional enemy as an obstacle. The Breakout concept continues to live on. While Atari hasn't really touched it since 1996's Breakout 2000, other developers have kept it alive through new Arkanoid games and even indie titles such as Shatter. For a game that no designer wanted to work on in the first place, the idea of bashing bricks with a ball and paddle has proved to be an impressively long-lived one. Next time, we're going for the hoop with the first good video game rendition of basketball.